Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, host of the Vision for Life podcast. The basis for everything we discuss on this podcast is God's revelation of himself to us. God's revelation surrounds us. His revelation of himself brings wisdom and clarity to those who lack the ability to see. It provides us with a unique spiritual light that allows us to see things that we couldn't previously, unaided by God's word and by God's spirit. And Dave Moreland and Hunter Beaumont are joining me on the podcast today. Welcome.
Hey, Autumn.
Autumn, it's great to be back with you. And Dave, let's quickly just do a little game here. Do we like my short, pithy intro from last week, or do we like Autumn's long, theologically robust intro this week?
You know what? I like the liturgy of Autumn's. I just felt pastored.
I did too. I did too.
She just led me to experience more of the Lord just in that introduction. So,
all right, Autumn, you win again.
Autumn 1, H0.
Well, I think that you did an outstanding job last week while I was out of the office. So thank you. Well, you know, your short, pithy intro was a great stand-in.
Well, thanks, Mom, for letting me make the cookies while you were out of town.
I'm glad to be back with you today. We are going to take on some topics related to the sermons that we are working our way through in August. Hunter, can you set us off on the right track? What are we covering in these sermons, and what's the purpose of the current sermon series that we're in the middle of right now?
Well, a few months ago, as Dave and I were talking about the end of the summer and getting into the fall, we really felt like we needed to set before our church some things that we need to prioritize. That's the word we're using right now. And the big thing about prioritizing is when you prioritize, you're really choosing between good things and good things. So you're kind of going beyond just like Christianity is, or discipleship to Jesus is just learning how to avoid bad and do good. Mm-hmm. And you're really getting into the more difficult work sometimes of saying, we actually have so many options for so many good things, and God graciously fills our lives with so many good things. We then now have to decide which of those are going to go in our life first. Which ones are we going to make sure are a regular part of our life, and which are going to be more seasoning. So that's what we mean by prioritize. And we felt like right now in this season that we're living through collectively as a society and as a church, we have a great opportunity when the pandemic kind of cleared our plates a little bit to ask, what do we want to put back in? And we also just need to be reminded, this is what a church is always giving itself to first, that really makes everything else it does full of life.
So in this sermon series, you're addressing topics that we as a church family are going to prioritize as we ask, what are we going to add back in? What are we going to be committed to first? And there's an aspect of this challenge then that extends to the individuals listening. So we as a church family together are going to prioritize the two topics that we're going to talk about today that we covered the last couple of weeks: gathered worship and the next generation. And then there's a component of this in our discussion that we're asking, then how does that exist in each of our lives? Not only as a church together, but how do we start to practice this so that together we can express this priority?
I'm glad you're pushing on the personal dimension of this, because it would be very easy in these sermons to go, this is important for us collectively as a church, but we're asking every member of our church to take a next step and say, what does it look like for this to be a priority for me personally? So thanks for bringing that out.
And so what we want to do on the podcast today is to start to talk about the practical implications of what these priorities mean. If we put them into practice in our lives, if we begin to make those decisions, then we're going to come to these junctures where those decisions actually require something of us. They require us to choose, as you were saying, between something good and good or good and best. And so then in that way, we begin to experience them in a really practical, pragmatic way that impacts our life and our time. And so that's what we're going to start to talk about in relation to the sermons.
Great.
The first of this series, on August 1st, Hunter, you preached a sermon about prioritizing gathered worship. And so, first, Dave, I would just love to hear your thoughts about what are some of those issues as we think about prioritizing gathered worship. If we actually try to do that, to set aside individually, personally, time on Sundays to come together as the family of God here at Fellowship and give our time and ourselves to that regularly, we're going to run into these decision points. So, what are some of the actual issues that people will begin to encounter?
Well, I think a lot of tension people feel is, first of all, in our context, the weekend is a competitive space. So there's always something else that's available. There's always some other option that's available, whether in the mountains or even just fun things happening around the city that are happening on Sunday morning. And as we've learned, the word church literally means gathered to gather together in a public space. And so to participate and be a part of church means that you're having to prioritize that gathered space and cut out other things that are competing for that space as well. So I think part of it is really a heart level kind of decision. Am I willing to trade off my kind of weekend activities in order to be part of church or not? And I've taken dozens of people over the years through a schedule inventory where couples and others who are like, I want to grow closer to God, or I want to prioritize God in my life. And I take them, and then we do a schedule inventory, and then I say, hey, what do your weeks look like? What do your weekends look like? And they've scheduled out all of their weekends throughout, months at a time. And I'm like, listen, if you want this to be a priority, it's just going to have to be reflected in your calendar. And that means those cool weekends away, you just have to cut those out if you want it to be a priority.
Do you mean entirely? Cut them out entirely?
Well, they're going to have to be deprioritized for it to be the thing that you always sort of default to. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't have a place in the mountains, so I don't have to make that decision.
Well, and I would maybe mention to our listeners too that you are taking a trip this weekend to Oklahoma to visit family, and you're not going to be present at church this weekend. So how do you personally wrestle through, there's some legitimate things I need to do, like go see family or take vacation. These are legitimate things. They're good things, right? As we're saying, how do you wrestle with that, and then also the need to be involved on weekends at church?
Yeah. Well, again, I think it's kind of what your habit is. Mm-hmm. So generally speaking, every year I'll take 6 weeks off on Sundays. So, and I'm kind of on pace for that this year. So that's not a habit, being gone every weekend, but there are 6 that I am gone, including this weekend.
I actually like that approach and might even recommend it to folks. It could be a good question to ask, or beginning of a good conversation to ask, what would it look like for this to be my normal rhythm to gather with the church on Sundays? And then how many weeks a year would it be appropriate or reasonable to have other things going on the weekend, other good things, which would be going on vacation or visiting family or going to the mountains, and just to ask, like, what would be an amount? I don't want to be legalistic or rigid about it and suggest like, well, there's a hard number for everyone and you've got to hit that number or that quota. That's not what we mean. But sometimes when we do ask the question of numbers, like how many number of weekends should I be away, it does start to get a little bit more real and more practical, and we actually get into the good question we need to be wrestling with rather than just letting our schedule happen to us.
Right. This is why I love actually looking at the calendar, because we all just kind of, it's crazy how life functions. Calendars get filled up. We say yes to invitations and, oh, we have this opportunity here and there. And just kind of almost passively before we know it, all of our weekends are filled up to Christmas. And we're like, where did the fall go? And gosh, I only made it to church a handful of times or whatever. And so it's great just to look at the calendar because we're limited. There's only a limited number of weekends that we have, and to on purpose make the decision to be in town for the weekend.
There's a part B to what you were saying that can get expressed in a couple of ways. I think in the theme of weekend activities that can be applicable to families in a very specific way with sports, or specific activities that are relative to your children that get scheduled on Sundays. There are also a tendency then within that to say, well, this is our free time or my free time or our family time. And actually those right there are two competing good priorities. Family time is a good priority. Time for your family to have fun together, to go have different experiences around the city, in the mountains. That is a good thing to desire. And it can compete with gathered worship, which is also something that we're taught is a good desire, something that is quintessential to the life of the family of God. We see that in the patterns in the New Testament and what we're taught in the lives. We see that in the life of the early church. And as Hunter, you mentioned in your sermons, in this apostolic theme and teaching. So these are two good competing priorities. And so to the families who would say, but this is the time that I have on my family time, does this fit in that same category where it's an admonition to look at your schedule instead of letting your schedule run you, look at it and make a choice. So avoid the passive decision making that can result when you simply slot things in without asking what is competing for this space.
Well, yes. And I think it's important for families at home to know, especially with little kids, just we get it. It's so hard. I mean, there's I remember when our kids were younger, kind of the most difficult, challenging family dynamics and marriage difficulties often happened on Sunday morning because you're waking the kids up earlier than when they want to wake up. We're forcing them to get dressed, and we're all getting in the car together, and we're all going to church. The kids are going berserk, and Renee and I feel that tension, and then it's like, oh, we're gonna go now, praise God, and
there's pressure at church to just, hi, how you doing? So good.
Absolutely. Oh, everything's great. We hate each other, and so anyway, at home, if you feel similar tension, just know you're not alone with that. However, I will say on the other side, where now it doesn't take as much energy to go to church. There is a desire because our kids want to, usually, not always, usually. The value and the shaping effect of having gone to church for all these years has turned us into different kind of people. Our kids and Renee and I, and it shaped our hearts. And so even though you may think there could be no possible value in sort of initiating this family conflict every Sunday morning,
Bringing this chaos down on myself.
yeah, it is worth it. I can tell you, it is worth it. It may not feel like it in the midst, but it is worth it on the other side.
I know another dynamic a lot of families deal with, especially as their kids get a little older, are the kids' activities, and especially sports. Sports on the weekends and club sports and navigating that. And this is not just true in Denver. This is true everywhere, even in very churchy parts of the country. sports are more important than church, and so they've just seen that Sunday morning is a free space, and they've used that. So I know that's something a lot of families are going to have to navigate. And I want to put in a plug for a friend's podcast. My friend Bob Thune in Omaha, Nebraska. At his church, they do a podcast similar to our conversation. They call theirs the Wednesday Conversation, and if you search on your podcast app, you'll find the Wednesday Conversation by Coram Deo Church in Omaha, Nebraska. And they just did a conversation on club sports and how do you prioritize your kids' athletic development and competition, while also, if you're Christians, you've got other things that are maybe even more important to you than that. And yet this is the world you've got to kind of navigate to if your kids are going to play sports. So they did a great job on that, and I would recommend it to anyone who's asking that question.
We have some families at Fellowship who have done this well. This is a tricky issue because it isn't always clear. It's not always just black and white. This is the right and wrong choice, which is why we're having this conversation. Because again, it's simply a competing priority. Two good things: your children gaining confidence and working out their bodies, growing as a part of a team. They can learn so many good things through participation in team sports. And it does compete a lot of times for the same time that you would either put family time or when you would be going to church. I've watched some families at Fellowship navigate this very well, whose kids do participate in sports, and they continually ask, I think, as a family, what are we giving ourselves to? So there is always a trade-off, Dave, as you have wisely reminded me, us, in many, many different times and seasons of life. But they also talk to their children about the value of church and the necessity of being here as much as possible. And so they are still asking these questions actively. And that, I think, is what makes a big difference in how they choose to navigate it.
And one more thing I want to acknowledge here is that for a lot of people, Sunday mornings sits in this kind of default space of it's really discretionary time or it's free time that I have, and it's some of the only discretionary time that we often have left. And I even have to navigate this personally. Of course, I have to be here Sunday morning, not quite as early as the band, but I have to be here pretty early on Sunday morning, especially on weeks that I'm preaching. And that means that I just have to change my approach to Saturday nights. And Saturday night's a social night, and people go out and people do fun things on Saturday night. And every now and then, not that often, but every now and then they'll invite me. and so I have had to navigate that I just can't stay out very late on Saturday night. So it might be like I'm going to go join some folks for dinner, and I'm going to make sure that I'm done at 9 and I'm getting home because I need to really be in bed at 10 o'clock on Saturday night. And I just say that to point out, like, that might have to be part of your habit, especially if you really want to make Sunday morning priority. Is Saturday night's going to have to shift a little bit from what you would just do in default mode.
As people begin to ask these questions and say, okay, how am I going to use my Sunday mornings? What does it look like for me to prioritize gathered worship? Another issue that we may run into is this feeling of disconnect between what we know to be good and our emotional state about it at times. So sometimes our emotions can say, going to church sounds hard, or going to church just doesn't sound energizing to me. I don't have the motivation emotionally to go and do this. And I think that can occur for various reasons. But Dave, could you speak to that a bit, shed some light on those different reasons for us?
Sure. I know for a handful of people, going to church on Sunday mornings is difficult. And it's difficult not because they actually don't want to go. It's that they're in a relationship, their spouse doesn't want to go, or maybe their kids are really resistant to going. So church to you sounds like an absolute battle. And if there's not unity with desire to go to church with a couple, then it can be incredibly demotivating. And I know a lot of people are in that position. This is actually a historic position to be in, just so you know. In the New Testament, wives and husbands of unbelieving spouses are addressed specifically. So if that's you, I don't want you to feel like it's abnormal or that you're sort of not thought of. Scripture thinks of you specifically. And in that, I think there can be encouragement for someone just to say, hey, we get that it's hard. The best way that you win over a household is by you just being a disciple of Jesus, growing in love and compassion and peace, and actually being when you grow as a disciple, you're a more loving person to be around, and eventually people can actually, your husband or your wife can actually see the gospel making an impact in you. And so if you want to go to church and your spouse doesn't want to, not a Christian or whatever the situation may be, then a way to motivate your spouse isn't to shame them, but rather is actually to love them, is to showcase the love of Christ to your kids, to your spouse. And that's kind of the prescription that you see in Scripture. It actually makes them eventually want you to go to church, because you become a better person when you do it. And there's real power to that. And that's sort of a 2,000-year-old method that has worked when the household isn't united around going to church.
I have watched some spouses navigate this really well, and there's been a theme that I've always seen, and that is that the spouse who wants to go to church kind of very calmly just says, that's going to be a priority for me. It doesn't have to be a priority for you. They kind of give the other person permission for it not to be a priority for them, but they don't let that forfeit it being a priority for them. And so it's maybe a unique or kind of outlier space in their marriage where we just don't do the same thing at the same time. And they come to church regularly, even if their spouse is unwilling to come. And then the folks I've watched navigate this are really intentional about making sure that's the main place that they're differentiated, or the only big place, and they're just loving their spouse day in, day out in every area that they can.
That's right. And there's not this sort of subtle, like passive aggressive, like,
Right.
I wish, it sure would be nice if you were the head of the household, or if you were like the spiritual head. And there's all this kind of subtle stuff that can happen that actually makes your spouse not want to go to church even more.
Exactly. And the best ones don't do that. They just say, hey, that's okay. If it's not for you, this is important to me. And so I really, out of faithfulness to Jesus, who is who they're called to follow first, I'm going to do this, but I'm not going to harangue you or harass you or nag you or pressure you about it.
So in this same vein, Hunter, what would you say to the person who is considering this, prioritizing gathered worship, considering the implications for their life, their week, their time, and it simply boils down to, it feels like the effort to go isn't worthwhile?
Mm-hmm. Well, because gathering with the church fits in this space of it's something we do every week, week in, week out. Anything we do regularly like that is probably going to go through seasons where it doesn't feel as vibrant as it does in other seasons. Very similar to what we just talked about in our Daily Life with God series. Like, I have this rhythm of reading my Bible and praying every morning, and there's whole stretches of time where that doesn't feel as vibrant as it does in other stretches of time. This is just how rhythms and disciplines work. So what I would just kind of lay before folks to consider is there is a cumulative shaping effect of gathering with the body of Christ that's far bigger than what you get in any one experience of it. So we should not just evaluate the impact of this on kind of a week in, week out basis. So if we every time I read a book, I kind of go, was that a good book or not a good book? Did I like that book or not like that book? And even sometimes halfway through a book, I'm like, do I want to keep reading this book? I don't know if I want to keep reading this book. I think I've got everything I need to get out of this book. It's time to find a different book, right? And you just kind of evaluate it on a case by case basis, and it can be very easy to treat church like that. It's like, I'm just going to evaluate it on a week by week by week basis. Did I like that sermon? Was that helpful? Was the worship music good today? Did I feel connected to God today? And what I'm inviting us to do is to go, no, instead of evaluating like that, what if you looked at the big picture and said, what's the cumulative effect over years of gathering with the church? Just like I might say, any given book that I read is some are tens and some are twos, but there's a cumulative effect on my life of having a habit of reading that is awesome and amazing. And I would invite us to think the same way about church.
And that's exactly what Dave was sharing by way of example with families, his specific example of you and your family with young children, a word to families in that state about the effort that goes into making it happen does have this shaping effect. Mm-hmm. The prioritization, the commitment to this time and setting aside time for gathered worship has a shaping effect over time. We're going to shift gears here to talk about the practical implications of prioritizing the next generation. So our first sermon that we just discussed from this series was prioritize gathered worship. And the second one was prioritize the next generation. Hunter, what does that mean, prioritize the next generation?
The next generation is referring to the next spiritual generation or the generation of disciples that are coming behind us. So that for many of us, that includes our kids. That includes all the children and the students in our church. But it's even bigger than that. There's also adults who are coming to faith in Jesus right now, and they are the next generation behind me, even if they're just the same age as me, right? So it's just the passing on the faith to the spiritual generation that's right behind us, or learning how to take what God has given me and impart it to others. And I think this is, for many people, the missing ingredient in their faith, and it's actually the reason why their faith starts to feel dull or dry, and it's because they just haven't learned how to share it with others, and maybe they're not even aware that that's part of what they're called to do. But the nature of the gospel is such that it's meant to be handed on and passed on and given to others. And when we give it to other people, we see the work it does in their lives, and it's usually slightly different than, it's like the same, and yet in some ways it's different and unique, the work it does in their lives. So we actually start to see all these different dimensions of the gospel when we hand it off to other people, and it becomes much, much more dynamic. Whereas when we don't hand it off, the opposite happens. It starts to get kind of stale, and so we're kind of like, well, I mean, I think I've kind of exhausted this thing.
Do you think, Hunter, that when people hear the gospel, when they think about their spiritual life, why is it? I mean, I think you're onto something. Why is it that we tend to view it in such a sort of personal, individualistic kind of framework? I think of a lot of my friends who think of themselves as spiritual, but it's always so personal and so subjective. But what you're saying is that to experience the gospel has this relational sharing, like to really experience it, you have to share it. So why is that difficult for us? What challenge us in that?
Our society really is comfortable with private spiritual experience. So we're okay with that. We're okay with, you've got your spiritual habits and I've got mine. That's kind of acceptable within the world we live in. And so one of the reasons why I think it's easy not to even try to hand it off is it's comfortable and okay to be a Christian as long as it's primarily for you. When you start to hand it off to other people, it just starts to get more vulnerable. You start to feel more vulnerable, and that spiritual resistance that happens as a result of the way our world is kind of organized and what it will and won't allow, you start to run into that. Now, on the other hand, seeing God push through that and use you is one of the most powerful experiences you can have, and it just confirms your power, or sorry, and it just confirms the power of the gospel. A couple of years ago, I invited 8 guys to meet with me regularly on a Wednesday morning to talk about the daily life with God stuff, and to do that together. And I was scared to death to ask those guys to do it. I'm a pastor, and I do that regularly. And it was like, this was scary. It felt vulnerable. And so there was resistance there. And then the flip side was, I got to see what God was doing in these guys' lives, and we got to share it together. And it was an amazing, amazing experience that just grew and expanded my faith. But I don't want to discount how difficult it felt to even invite those men into that space.
You, in what you were just sharing there, Hunter, there's a theme that I have heard just in course of conversation from parents, particularly in regard to talking to their children about the gospel or about things in the Bible, about God, that goes something like, I just don't know how to, or I don't feel equipped to do this. So when you talk about investing in the next generation, or discipling someone, or investing your life in someone, you mentioned right there feeling vulnerable, and you said, and I'm a pastor.
Right.
And so that sense, I think, is true for many people, that they feel ill-equipped to do exactly what you're challenging them to do. Dave, I'm going to pivot to you here. You actually do this regularly through classes, through as a seminary professor, as a mentor, whether people seek it out or it sort of coincidentally happens in relationship, as a father. You invest in people really well, regularly, all the time. Do you run across this sentiment as you are raising up leaders and investing in other people? I know a part of what you do is seek out young leaders to actually start to do that. So for instance, in your men's Bible study, not only are you teaching the men, but you ask every year a couple of young leaders to help you lead that Bible study, because you're doing this. You're teaching them how to invest in others. Do you run into this same sense of, I don't know how to do this, or I feel not equipped to do this?
Definitely. And it's never not vulnerable. And in fact, I would actually say, if you're doing this and you feel like you have it down, or you kind of have mastered a method, then you may not be sharing what the gospel is actually doing in your life. You've maybe have professionalized it. And that's a caution. So, I mean, I would say for anyone who wants to prioritize the next generation, the most important thing you can do is just to continue to develop an authentic, vibrant time with God yourself. And that time that we've been talking about on this podcast is the energy, it's the lifeblood of what it is that you share on to the next generation. I was thinking, even just in my personal time in the morning, early in the morning, I've never sort of on purpose taught my kids to have that similar time. However, over the years, they've just seen that that's what their dad does. And all of them at some point or another have asked me, Dad, what do you do in that time? How do you do that? And they sense it being a place of joy for me, and they want some of that. And so I would say, for anyone who wants to begin to share it, the first thing to do is to it's take that Bill Smith method or whatever, and to develop that time. And it's really that time and what you're learning, that time that you're sharing with other people.
It comes from an overflow of what God's doing in you, and you don't have to have a perfect life. You just have to have God doing something in you, and then you
That's
have
right.
something to share. I do want to push here a little bit, though, and I want to just bring to the surface something that you guys have all mentioned. Autumn, you said Dave does Bible studies and he teaches classes. I mentioned, like, I asked 8 guys to meet me on Wednesday morning at 6 o'clock. And the thing I want to just bring out is this. You often need a structure in which you are going to impart what God is doing in you. And so it's usually not enough just to have God doing some good things in me, and I hope that some others catch it. You know, it can happen with your kids because they live with you in a very tiny house. And so
Yes.
they literally can see you every day, right? But that's not going to be the case in a lot of instances, and you've actually got to create or get involved in a structure that allows you to do that. This is why we create structures at church, like we create structures like kids' classes, right? All you have to do to be used by God is to learn whatever the kids are going to learn about an hour before they learn it, and then
How about let's say a day before?
a day before they
Okay,
learn it,
thanks.
and then you show up, and the structure is there, and someone has thought really well about how to create an environment where kids can actually get something, and they're going to teach you that structure, and you're just going to impart it within that structure. So the structure actually helps you do it. So many times it's finding a structure that already exists. I think this is why people are drawn to ministries like Bible Study Fellowship and things. They set a structure that helps people impart to others. This is what I decided to do when I created my own structure. I just said, I'm going to create a structure. It's going to be called Wednesday morning, 6 a.m. at my house, around my kitchen table. And then I had to go, and here's what we're going to do for an hour and a half. Here's what we're going to do, fill that hour and a half with. I'm going to ask these questions. I'm going to kind of teach this. We're going to reflect on this. This is going to be the structure of our time together. So creating that structure then allowed it to happen. And so that I just want to lay before our listeners, to take a step in this, you might need to either find a structure to get involved in that already exists, or you might need to create a structure. A structure can be really simple too. Like if you're trying to impart faith to your children, it might just be a structure of, we're going to read a Bible story before bed and pray together. That's a very simple structure.
So in answer to that specific question, if you've never considered, I need to invest my life in others, the gospel is meant to be shared. Some good things to think about, some good starting points are: make sure it's true to yourself, that you have a relationship with God, that you are learning, that you're connected to God. Model discipleship, so share what you yourself are learning. It doesn't have to be all figured out. You can simply share the questions you have, what you are thinking about based on the sermon, what you are learning through your devotional time with God, any of those things. Just share what you're learning, model discipleship. And then lastly, find a structure that will enable you to do this, even if it's a simple structure. And as you do that, you'll start to see then how the gospel actually, you experience the fullness of the gospel when you're sharing faith with someone else.
Well, this has been a really good conversation to flesh out some of the real practical things we run into. And we're going to be doing this for the next 2 things we talk about prioritizing. We're going to devote 1 episode to each of those and help flesh this out a little bit. So part of the rhythm we're even enacting here, part of the structure we've created, is we want to cast the vision through the preaching on Sunday and show you the biblical basis. And then we're going to come in the week and talk on this podcast to help our listeners and help us put some flesh on it.
Hunter, Dave, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music. and to our producer, Jesse Cowan.